I'm not sure if I can really get to what I'm thinking about today, but it's to do with some of the ideas that I've talked about in some of these videos before, which kind of contradict an idea of what a person is, that contradicts the intuitive idea of what a person is, the one that certainly I seem to be experiencing. Because certainly the way I feel is, I feel like I'm a relatively solid, relatively permanent object, located in space, relatively bounded, relatively distinct from the environment. Don't feel like I'm changing terribly much, that kind of identity thing, I suppose, really. What I'm thinking about is that lots of, and this isn't an original idea by any means, but there's lots of ideas which kind of fly in the face of that intuitive perception of oneself. And things I've spoken about in the past is, for example, this idea that oneself is that one's body at least is a kind of fountain, that none of the molecules that are in my body right now were in there 7 years ago, or thereabouts. And not most, but certainly hundreds of thousands of blood cells that are part of my body right now will not belong to be part of my body by the time I get to the end of this sentence, because the turnover rate of blood cells is very high. Similarly, the lining of my stomach will be exchanging itself every few hours. My fingernails will be growing out and falling off. My hair is constantly changing. And that's the same for every single cell in my body. So this, although the shape of my body stays more or less consistent, it's more like a conduit for, that's not right, but it's more like a fountain. There's things passing through it. It's a locus of exchange rather than a fixed object. So that's the first idea, this sense of the self as a kind of fountain through which the material substance of the world passes, just momentarily adopting that shape in its journey through. The second thing is to do with Liebig's famous experiment, which seemed on the face of it at least to question what free will was. It's a pretty well-known experiment, so I don't really need to rehearse it here. But basically, the results suggested that intentionality that we feel just prior to making a decision, it feels like there's a self that's making a kind of decision in the world, and initiating that decision by some kind of conscious process. His experiments seriously question that and suggest that decision-making process is part of a continual chain of causation that begins prior to conscious awareness, possibly starts outside of the body entirely, and just sort of grazes the sides of consciousness on its way towards its implementation in the world. In that particular experiment, you're invited to press a button at a certain point of your choosing, whilst your body and brain are wired up to certain sensors, and it's clear from that the readiness potential, the beginnings of movement, start before you consciously make a decision. So this movement and activity and behaviour in the world precedes one's conscious engagement with that world, which again suggests a kind of causal, if that's the right word, causal storm passing through us at all times, only some of which makes contact with consciousness, and which consciousness has only probably a sort of passing relationship with, in terms of its ability to initiate those movements. So that's the second bit. The third thing is to do with body language isn't a strong enough word, but the idea that we are constantly responding, or our bodies are constantly responding to the environment in which we live without our awareness. seem to be able to detect patterns in the world and respond to those patterns, again without any contact with consciousness. And here I'm thinking particularly of experiments in blind sight, where patients who have split brains for whatever reason are able to make good guesses as to what object is appearing in the field of vision, even when they're not consciously aware of that field of vision, just because of the way that the brain has been affected. And also to do with judgment. I think Dika House made some experiments with that about how to make intuitive judgments based on quite complex information. How we're able to do that, but not consciously. We're able to sort of penetrate the patterns of experience and make judgments based on those patterns, even though we're not aware of those patterns. And on a much simpler level, just the processes of things like recognition and noticing. You know, when I look around the world, certainly I'm seeing trees and canals and dogs and all that kind of stuff. And it's completely effortless. These things are just kind of flowing into my perceptual field, flowing out again. And I'm not sure to what extent I'm present in that flow, other than as a kind of guest, really. Okay, so that'll do for now. There's some other sources of evidence that I think I've got, which I'll come back to perhaps another time. But what these are all suggesting to me is that this image of ourselves is a kind of semi-static object fixed in space with clear boundaries, a figure against an undifferentiated ground, is just not part of that at all, really. It's much more like we are just kind of caught up in this perfect storm of information which is flowing through us in purely substantive terms. The substance of our bodies is flowing through us. The information of the world is flowing through our perceptions. The causal relationships between one event and the next are flowing through us in a really complex, multivalent way. And it's more like we're just kind of flickering screens through which this storm is passing and on which this storm is being momentarily registered. It sounds a bit bleak, actually. Storm is a bit of an unfortunate choice of words, perhaps. But I mean storm in the sense that a storm is an identifiable object in a sense, but it has an identity, but it also has a chaos within it and a complexity within it. Which is not static and not fixed, not bounded. I'm not sure where that leaves things like consciousness and intentionality and accountability and all those terms. I'll have to come back to that, I think. It feels very quiet here today on this bank of this canal. It's quite strange to think that there's a big storm going on.